He hired me to play a part. I was meant to wear a white silk dress, stand beside him in a quiet chapel, and sign my name on a line that would erase my past and secure his future. But before we begin, take a breath. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. If you believe some stories are meant to be felt more than told, then pull up a chair and stay in the silence with me. Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. That is the truth of how it began, though the reality of that morning felt less like a romance and more like a surrender. It was 5 a.m, and the coastal rain was beating a steady, gray rhythm against the fogged glass of my bakery. The world outside was cold and unforgiving, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of fermented yeast, melting butter, and the dried lavender I ground by hand every dawn. I stood at the chipped wooden counter, leaning my weight into a mound of pale dough, trying to push the anxiety out of my chest and into the flour. This small shop was not just a business. It was a fortress built by my late mother, Helen. Her memory lived in the worn grooves of the rolling pins and the faded, grease-stained pages of her handwritten, maternal diary that sat open on the shelf. The bakery was the only anchor I had left, but anchors are heavy, and the tide of my father's inherited debts had finally risen too high. The final notice from the bank rested beneath a ceramic coffee mug on the register, its stark black letters promising foreclosure by the end of the month. I had spent the last 3 weeks rationing flour and working through the night, desperately trying to outrun the inevitable. I did not stop kneading when the long, sleek, black town car pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the early morning gloom. I only paused when the bell above the door chimed, a sharp, cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place for the man who stepped inside. Arthur Pendleton did not belong in a working-class kitchen. The family lawyer was a man of clinical precision, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that seemed to repel the warmth of the room. He closed his wet umbrella with a definitive snap, his sharp eyes scanning the flour-dusted floorboards, the cooling racks of pastries, and finally, me. He did not offer small talk. Men like him never did. He stepped up to the counter, placed a heavy, dark leather briefcase down on the worn wood, and opened the brass latches with a quiet click. I wiped my hands on my apron, refusing to apologize for the mess or the flour clinging to my hairline. I kept my chin leveled, maintaining a silent barrier of self-respect. I was drowning in debt, but I was not going to hand over my dignity to a man who looked at my mother's sanctuary as if it were a temporary inconvenience. Arthur withdrew a thick stack of heavy legal parchment and laid it out between us. The document was flawless, sterile, and cold. He explained the terms in a voice that held no inflection, treating my life like a minor corporate merger. Julian Sterling, a reclusive real estate developer whose family empire spanned the coast, required a wife. It was a matter of optics, a necessary maneuver to unlock an ancestral trust and project stability to a conservative board of directors. Julian did not want a complicated society bride who would demand his time or pry into his heavily guarded private life. He wanted someone quiet, someone respectable, someone who understood the boundaries of a transaction. In exchange for 12 months of my life, playing the role of the devoted wife at public galas and family dinners, Julian would pay off every cent of my father's debt. The bakery would be saved. The deed would be transferred entirely into my name, free and clear. It was an absolute erasure of the financial ruin that had been suffocating me for years. As Arthur handed me a heavy gold fountain pen, the metal cold against my calloused fingers. I looked down at the precise, typed lines of the marriage contract, searching for a catch, a hidden clause that would demand my cisne soul. But there was only the cold, unyielding reality of the exchange. I did not cry. I refused to play the tragic, helpless victim in front of a man who measured worth in bank statements. Instead, I analyzed the distance between the life I had known and the one I was about to enter. I pressed my thumb against the bottom corner of the contract to hold it steady, leaving a faint, unmistakable smudge of lavender flower dust on the pristine white parchment. The visual contrast was absurd. A multi-million-dollar legal agreement, designed to secure an empire, stained by the simple raw ingredients of a sourdough starter. I signed my name. The ink flowed dark and heavy, sealing my fate. Arthur meticulously packed the document back into his briefcase, offering a stiff nod of approval before turning toward the door. He paused only to tell me that a car would arrive in 3 days, to take me to the Sterling ancestral estate in New England, where I would meet my new husband and his family. When the door clicked shut behind the lawyer, I was left alone in the heavy silence of the kitchen, the scent of lavender suddenly feeling very small against the massive shadow of what I had just done. 3 days later, the coastal rain had frozen into a quiet, reluctant snowfall. The sky was a pale, unbroken gray, hanging low over the Atlantic as the town car carried us away from everything I knew. Julian Sterling sat beside me in the back seat, and for the first hour, we did not exchange a single word. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and heavy silences, his physical presence reminding me of winter stone and dark steel. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, his gaze fixed firmly on the passing trees, his jaw tight. I sat as close to my door as possible, analyzing the space between us. He had not touched me when we met at the registry office to finalize the paperwork, nor had he offered any grand, hollow declarations of gratitude. His communication was entirely practical. When he noticed me subtly pulling my thin cardigan tighter around my shoulders, he did not speak. He simply reached forward and adjusted the climate control on the console, turning the heat up on my side of the car. It was a microscopic act of service, executed without looking at me. But it was the first crack in the clinical armor I had expected him to wear. The silence stretched on, dense and heavy, but it was not the hostile, toxic silence I had braced myself for. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. I watched the snow beat against the cold glass of the window, isolating us in this moving metal box. I was a commodity, a pawn, in a game of generational wealth, wearing a simple woolen skirt and a coat that had seen too much winter. Yet Julian did not look at me with pity or disdain. He simply offered me the dignity of quiet space, refusing to force an unnatural conversation just to fill the air. By late afternoon, the car turned onto a winding, private road, lined with towering, ancient pines heavy with snow. The Sterling ancestral mansion slowly revealed itself through the trees. It was a sprawling, imposing structure of heavy gray stone, crescent windows, and dark slate roofs. It did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress designed to keep the world out. As the car rolled to a stop on the circular gravel drive, a profound sense of isolation washed over me. I looked down at the expensive, flawless diamond ring Julian had provided, resting on my flower-ruined finger. It felt incredibly heavy, a cold shackle tying me to a world I did not understand. Julian stepped out first, the freezing air rushing into the cabin. He walked around the back of the car and opened my door, extending a gloved hand. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing my hand in his. His grip was firm, supportive, but entirely impersonal. He did not pull me close or attempt to play the placating husband for the driver. He simply shielded my side from the biting wind as we walked up the wide stone steps toward the massive oak front doors. The moment we crossed the threshold on that third day, the brutal cold of the New England winter vanished, replaced by a deep, resonant warmth. The foyer was vast, but it did not feel like the sterile corporate offices I had imagined. The air smelled of burning cedarwood, melting beeswax candles, and the faint, dry scent of old paper drifting from distant libraries. The floors were polished dark wood, and the lighting was soft, casting long amber shadows against the heavy stone walls. Julian did not force any awkward introductions. Instead, he led me to a sprawling guest suite in the eastern wing, offering me the quiet dignity of a closed door to rest after the long journey. It wasn't until the following morning that the true nature of the house revealed itself. I was navigating the sunlit foyer when a voice echoed through the space. Julian. The voice was soft, melodic, and entirely devoid of the sharp, aristocratic edge I had been dreading. I turned to see an older woman stepping out from an adjoining parlor. Maeve Sterling moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her posture perfect despite the silver in her hair and the delicate cane she held in her right hand. Her eyes, pale and clouded over with age and blindness, were fixed somewhere near Julian's chest, but there was an undeniable warmth radiating from her serene expression. Julian's posture shifted immediately. The rigid, winter stone tension in his shoulders dropped. He stepped forward, leaving my side for a moment, to gently take his grandmother's free arm, leaning down so she could press a soft kiss to his cheek. It was a stunning transformation, watching this untouchable, ruthless developer humble himself so quietly, his physical presence softening out of pure devotion to the blind matriarch. "You brought her," Maeve murmured, her voice carrying a heavy, knowing weight. "I did," Julian replied, his tone lower, softer than I had ever heard it. He turned his head toward me. Though he did not issue a command, he simply left the space open for me to step forward. I approached slowly, the thick soles of my practical boots making no sound on the heavy woven rug. I had spent hours agonizing over this introduction, worried that my lack of pedigree, my cheap clothes, and my sheer lack of belonging would immediately expose the transaction for what it was. I waited for the inevitable judgment, for the cold assessment of a family that traded in empires. But Maeve did not ask about my family name. She did not ask about my education or my background. Instead, she reached out her free hand, her palm open and searching in the space between us. I closed the distance and gently placed my hand in hers. Her skin was thin, delicate as parchment, but her grip was surprisingly warm and grounded. I expected her to feel the massive cold diamond on my ring finger, to assess the financial weight of the lie Julian and I had constructed. But she ignored the ring entirely. Her thumb bypassed the metal and brushed deliberately over the center of my palm, mapping the rough calluses earned from years of kneading dough. Scraping baking sheets and hauling heavy sacks of grain, she held my hands in the silence, her clouded eyes unmoving, yet seeing far more than anyone else in the room. She inhaled deeply, tilting her head slightly as the scent of the cold, winter air mixed with the lingering traces of my life. "Lavender," she whispered, a slow, gentle smile breaking across her face. "And flour. A worker's hands. Good." I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my throat, a wave of unexpected vulnerability crashing through my defensive walls. For the first time since my mother died, someone was looking past the utility of what I could provide and acknowledging the quiet, back-breaking reality of who I was. Maeve did not see a transactional bride. She felt the resilience in my skin. I looked up and caught Julian watching us. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on where his grandmother held my hands. He wasn't acting. He wasn't monitoring a business asset. He was holding his breath, his expression entirely unguarded, tracking the subtle shift in the room with an intensity that made my heart stumble. Maeve released my left hand, but kept my right tucked safely between her warm palms. She tilted her face slightly toward where Julian was standing, her smile deepening into something incredibly private and profound. "Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence," Maeve said softly, her voice echoing gently off the heavy stone walls. "Welcome home, Clara." I stood in the grand, cedar-scented foyer of a house that did not belong to me, tied to a man who had bought my freedom with a cold piece of paper. Yet, as the warmth of the fire crackled in the next room, and Julian quietly stepped closer to stand at my shoulder, forming a silent, protective barrier between me and the open door, I realized my calculations had been wrong. I had expected a sterile prison of wealth and obligation. But as the scent of lavender mixed with the old wood of the estate, I felt the terrifying, impossible sensation that I had just been handed the keys to a sanctuary. The next 24 hours passed inside the heavy stone walls of the Sterling estate, blurring into a quiet, snow-muffled reality. The mansion was a masterpiece of architectural isolation, a place where time seemed to slow down and stretch out across the vast, empty corridors. I spent that first full day navigating the space with the cautious precision of an intruder who expected to be caught. The staff was polite, invisible, and terrifyingly efficient. My wardrobe had been quietly supplemented with heavy cashmere sweaters and tailored wool trousers that did not bear any visible designer labels, yet hung with the unmistakable weight of generational wealth. I was surrounded by a cold, immaculate luxury that demanded absolutely nothing of me, and that was precisely what made it unbearable. I was a woman accustomed to the brutal, unforgiving rhythm of a working-class kitchen. My days had always been measured in the ounces of flour weighed, the hours spent kneading dough until my shoulders burned, and the endless tally of debts that chased me to sleep. Here, in this fortress of quiet opulence, my hands had nothing to do. The silence of the estate was not hostile, but it was heavy, and by the morning of my 5th day in the arrangement, the sheer lack of utility was driving me to the edge of my composure. I needed a tether. I needed to prove to myself that the woman who had fought to keep her mother's legacy alive had not been entirely erased by a signature on a marriage contract. Before the sun had fully crested the tree line, I left my cavernous bedroom and navigated the winding hallways until I found the estate's primer kitchen. It was an intimidating room of cold, veined marble, gleaming stainless steel, and heavy copper pots hanging from an iron rack like silent polished bells. It was a space designed for a team of private chefs, not a lone baker in a borrowed sweater. But as I opened the massive pantry doors, I found the basic universal elements of my trade: raw flour, unrefined sugar, cold butter, and baking powder. I had brought a small glass jar of dried lavender from my own shop, tucking it into my suitcase as a talisman against the unknown. Now, I set it on the sterile marble counter, the purple buds looking small and out of place in the grand room. I began to work. The physical act of baking was an involuntary muscle memory, a ritual that instantly grounded the chaotic swirl of my thoughts. I measured the flour by eye, the soft white powder dusting the dark marble. I cut the cold butter into the dry ingredients, my fingertips pressing and crumbling the mixture until it resembled coarse sand. The rhythm of my movements, the repetitive, focused labor, pulled the tension from my spine. I crushed the dried lavender between my palms, releasing a sharp, floral fragrance that cut straight through the clinical beeswax scent of the mansion. For the first time since Arthur Pendleton had laid that sterile legal document on my chipped wooden counter, I felt like I was occupying my own skin. I did not hear him approach. The thick woven rugs of the hallway swallowed any sound of footsteps, and the man who owned this empire possessed a startlingly quiet physical presence. I only noticed Julian when the draft in the room subtly shifted, a change in the atmospheric pressure that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I paused, my hands buried deep in the pale, lavender-flecked dough, and turned my head. He was standing in the wide archway of the kitchen, leaning slightly against the dark wood frame. He was not dressed in the sharp clinical suits he wore to the city, nor the heavy winter overcoat from our arrival. He wore a simple dark charcoal sweater pushed up at the forearms, his dark hair slightly rumpled, as if he had also spent the night wrestling with the heavy silence of the house. He did not speak. He did not ask what I was doing or politely demand that I leave the labor to his staff. He simply watched me. His gaze was steady, tracking the flour dusted across my apron, the stray lock of hair that had escaped my loose bun, and the frantic, defensive energy I was currently kneading into the biscuits. I expected a reprimand. I expected the cold, calculating developer to remind me that his contracted wife should not be performing manual labor before breakfast. Instead, his posture remained entirely open, his jaw relaxed, his dark eyes anchored on me with an intensity that made the vast kitchen feel suddenly, dangerously small. "I needed something to do," I said, my voice sounding far too loud in the quiet room. It was a defensive statement, an instinctual justification born from years of having to defend my space. Julian pushed off the doorframe and stepped into the room. His strides were slow, measured, lacking any of the predatory urgency I associated with men of his station. He stopped on the opposite side of the marble island, his gaze dropping to the mound of dough between my hands. The scent of the blooming lavender hovered in the air between us, a tangible bridge across the cold stone. "You don't have to explain your existence here, Clara," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate directly into the marble beneath my palms. It was the first time he had used my given name since we signed the papers. The sound of it on his lips was heavy, stripped of all legal formality, carrying a quiet respect that I did not know how to categorize. I swallowed hard, looking down at my messy, flour-caked hands. The dough was ready. I shaped it into a rough rectangle, grabbed a metal cutter from the drawer, and began pressing out the biscuits with sharp, definitive motions. I transferred them to a heavy iron baking sheet, my movements jerky and uncoordinated under his silent observation. When the pan was full, I slid it into the preheated oven and closed the heavy door with a solid thud. The task was done, leaving me entirely exposed. My hands were coated in a thick layer of sticky dough and white powder. I turned toward the massive copper sink set into the far counter, intending to scrub the evidence of my vulnerability away. But Julian moved first. He crossed the distance between us before I could take a step, placing himself directly between me and the sink. I froze, every defensive instinct flaring to life, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. We had not stood this close since the perfunctory handshake outside the car. The physical proximity was overwhelming. He smelled of cedarwood, cold winter air, and an undercurrent of dark coffee. He did not reach for my waist or attempt any grand romantic gesture that a lesser man might use to assert dominance. He simply turned his back to me slightly, reached out, and twisted the heavy brass handles of the faucet. The warm water cascaded into the copper basin with a soft, steady rush. He pulled a clean, white linen towel from the rack beside the sink and wet one corner of it, wringing out the excess moisture with slow, deliberate strength. Then he turned back to me. He held out his large, calloused hand, his palm open, waiting. I stared at his extended hand, my breath catching in my throat. This was the man who moved millions of dollars with a single phone call, the reclusive tycoon who viewed human interaction as a liability. Yet here he was, offering a silent domestic act of service that required the absolute surrender of his pride. I hesitated, my own pride warring with the bone-deep exhaustion of fighting the world alone. Slowly, reluctantly, I lifted my right hand and placed it into his. His grip was incredibly gentle. He did not pull me off balance or force me closer. He simply supported my wrist with his fingers, the warmth of his skin seeping into my cold, aching joints. Using the damp linen cloth, he began to wipe the flour and dried dough from my skin. His movements were methodical, reverent, executing the task with the same focused intensity he might apply to dismantling a corporate rival. He traced the cloth over my knuckles, carefully working the sticky residue from the spaces between my fingers, his thumb applying a soft, soothing pressure to the raw calluses on my palm. The silence in the kitchen shifted. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of a strange house. It was the peaceful, suspended silence of a shared sanctuary. I watched the dark crown of his head as he focused entirely on my hand, analyzing the stark contrast between the ruthless reputation of his name and the profound, tender reality of his touch. He washed my left hand with the same agonizingly slow care, carefully working the cloth around the heavy diamond ring that bound us together, treating the cheap, flour-dusted metal of my reality with far more reverence than the flawless gem. When both of my hands were completely clean, he did not immediately let go. He held my fingers loosely in his thumb lightly brushing the back of my hand one final time. He lifted his gaze, his dark eyes meeting mine. There were 1,000 things I wanted to ask him. 100 defensive walls I wanted to rebuild, but the absolute vulnerability in his expression silenced me. He was not looking at a contracted asset. He was looking at me. Julian released my hands, draped the damp linen over the edge of the sink, and stepped back, offering me the physical space my pride demanded. He turned without a word and walked quietly out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the warm rush of the water and the sudden, terrifying realization that the man I had married on paper was quietly, systematically tearing down every defensive barrier I owned. By the following afternoon, the winter storm had finally broken, leaving the sprawling grounds of the estate bathed in a stark, blinding white light. The shift in the weather did little to settle the profound unsteadiness taking root in my chest. I wandered through the quiet, wood-paneled corridors, actively avoiding the library, where Julian's was cluttered with his international conference calls. I needed distance. I needed to remind myself of the transactional nature of my presence here. But the memory of his broad hands carefully washing the flour from my skin refused to fade. My aimless pacing eventually led me to the southern wing of the house, where the heavy stone walls gave way to an expansive, glass-enclosed sunroom. The temperature inside was distinctly warmer, the air thick with the earthy scent of potted ferns, blooming winter orchids, and the delicate, curling steam of jasmine tea. Maeve Sterling sat in a high-backed wicker chair near the center of the room, her face turned toward the massive windows, bathing in the pale sunlight. Despite her blindness, she possessed an uncanny awareness of her surroundings. She did not startle when my boots lightly pressed against the threshold. "The snow has stopped, hasn't it?" she asked, her voice carrying that same soft, melodic cadence that had welcomed me. Yes, I replied softly, stepping into the humid green sanctuary. The sky is completely clear. Good. The house always holds its breath when it snows, she murmured, gesturing with a frail hand toward the empty chair across from her. Sit with me, Clara. There is a fresh cup on the tray. I crossed the room and sat down, the wicker creaking slightly under my weight. A delicate porcelain teapot sat on a low wrought iron table between us, alongside 2 hand-painted cups. I reached out, pouring the pale, fragrant jasmine tea into the empty cup, the familiar, grounding ritual of the pour, offering a brief moment of calm. I wrapped my hands around the warm porcelain, letting the heat seep into my skin, and looked at the older woman. Maeve's clouded eyes remained fixed on the light, her expression utterly serene. You are restless today, she observed quietly. It was not a question. I'm not used to having nothing to do, I admitted, keeping my tone carefully neutral. In my shop, if you stand still for too long, you lose money or you burn the bread. Here, everything is already done. Maeve smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. This house was built by men who believed that stillness was a sign of power. They built empires, bought ships, and laid railroads, and they designed this home to be a monument to their untouchable status. It is a very cold legacy to inherit. She slowly brought her teacup to her lips, taking a measured sip. Julian's father was a man carved entirely from that ice. He demanded perfection, efficiency, and absolute emotional detachment. He taught my grandson that vulnerability was a liability to be exploited. I traced the rim of my cup, my chest tightening at the casual mention of Julian's past. I had spent so much time viewing him as the architect of my current situation that I had rarely considered the architecture of the man himself. Julian learned to survive by building walls. Maeve continued, her tone dropping into a melancholic register. He learned to use wealth, legalities, and contracts as shields. If he controlled the parameters of an interaction, he could not be hurt. He became the ruthless developer the board wanted, but in doing so, he locked himself away in a very dark, very quiet room. She lowered her cup, her unseeing eyes seeming to search the space between us. When Arthur Pendleton told me that Julian was bringing a bride to the estate, I was terrified. I thought he had finally surrendered to the coldness of the sterling name. I thought he had purchased a corporate accessory to satisfy the shareholders. My grip on the porcelain cup tightened until my knuckles turned white. The sudden, blunt acknowledgement of the transactions stripped the air from my lungs. I braced myself for the inevitable reprimand, for the matriarch to politely but firmly explain the boundaries of my temporary stay, to remind me that I was a paid employee playing a role. I stared at the dark surface of my tea, shame rising hot and bitter in my throat. But then, Maeve said softly, the silence stretching out around her words, you walk through the front door. I looked up, my pulse pounding loudly in my ears. Maeve reached out across the small table, her hand finding mine with unerring accuracy. Her warm, paper-thin fingers covered my rigid ones, offering a gentle maternal squeeze. You think I do not know what this arrangement is, she said, her voice entirely devoid of judgment or anger. It was a statement of profound, gentle fact. I froze, the defensive armor I had worn for years completely shattering. Maeve, Hush, Clara, she interrupted gently, her thumb lightly brushing the back of my hand. The eyes are easily fooled by flawless diamonds and meticulously typed legal ink. They look at a contract and see truth. But the ears are not so easily deceived. I do not need to see a piece of paper to know the reality of what is happening in my own home. She released my hand and leaned back, a soft, wistful smile returning to her face. I hear it. I hear the truth in the cadence of his voice. For 30 years, I have listened to that boy speak in the sharp, heavy tones of a man expecting a betrayal. But the moment you enter a room, Clara, his voice drops an octave. The harsh edges vanish. He speaks to you with a softness I have not heard since he was a child. I sat perfectly still, unable to breathe, unable to process the magnitude of her observation. And I hear him at night. Maeve continued, her words falling like heavy, undeniable stones into the quiet room. This old house settles loudly in the winter, but I know the sound of my grandson's boots. At 2 a.m, when the world is entirely dark, I hear his heavy footsteps on the hardwood outside your bedroom door. He does not knock. He does not go in. He simply walks the perimeter, pacing the hall to ensure you are safe before he allows himself to sleep. A sharp physical ache bloomed in the center of my chest. The memory of the floorboards creaking outside my door the previous night flashed through my mind. I had assumed it was the wind, the ancient architecture groaning under the weight of the snow. I had never imagined it was the stoic, untouchable tycoon, acting as a silent sentinel, standing guard over a woman he had supposedly hired for a public relations stunt. Arthur Pendleton is a meticulous lawyer, Maeve whispered, the steam from the tea curling between us like a physical manifestation of the secrets being unraveled. But he is a fool if he thinks a piece of paper can hide a man's heart. Julian did not hire a corporate bride, Clara. He used the only language he knew, the language of contracts and debts, to build a wall around you, to protect you from a world that was crushing you, without wounding your fierce, beautiful pride. Tears, hot and unbidden, pricked the corners of my eyes. The narrative I had carefully constructed, the transactional lie I had used to protect my own vulnerability, was dissolving into dust. The man who had bought my father's debt had not done it to control me. He had done it to set me free, wrapping his devotion in a sterile legal document, because he was too terrified to offer it any other way. Maeve tilted her head, her blind eyes resting on my face, as if she could see the exact moment my worldview fractured. She reached out one last time, her fingers finding mine, in the quiet, sun-drenched sanctuary. Sometimes love doesn't knock. It waits, she said softly, the absolute certainty in her voice anchoring me to the earth. It waits in the silence, Clara. You only have to be brave enough to listen. The silence in the sunroom stretched out heavy and golden. Maeve's gentle hand remained over mine, offering a quiet anchor while the foundation of my reality shifted. I had walked into this ancestral home, believing I was nothing more than a calculated line item on a corporate ledger. But the truth she had just gently laid bare was far more terrifying than any cold transaction. I was not a business asset. I was a woman being silently, fiercely protected by a man who did not know how to ask for my heart. When I finally stood up, my legs felt unsteady. I excused myself in a voice barely above a whisper, leaving the warm sanctuary of the sunroom and its jasmine tea. I stepped back into the sprawling, wood-paneled corridors of the Sterling estate. The heavy stone walls suddenly felt less like a sterile prison, and more like a massive fortress, designed to keep the brutal world at bay. I spent the remainder of that afternoon, and the entirety of the following day, locked in a quiet, agonizing internal debate. I needed to analyze the distance between the lie I had signed and the truth I was walking toward. I had spent my entire adult life bracing for the next blow. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. I had built my pride into a weapon, using it to hold the reclusive developer at arm's length. But the memory of Maeve's words refused to let me hide. By the time night fell on the 7th day of our arrangement, the silence in my room became unbearable. The walk from the guest wing to the central library felt like crossing an ocean. As the scent of cedarwood and old paper grew stronger from his private sanctuary, my defensive armor finally began to crack. I stopped in front of the massive mahogany doors of the library. I reached out, my fingers wrapping around the cold brass handle. I did not knock. For the first time since Arthur Pendleton had laid that sterile legal document on my flour-dusted counter, I chose to cross a boundary without waiting for permission. I pushed the door open. The cavernous, dimly lit library smelled of aging leather, dark roasted coffee, and the sharp scent of winter air seeping through the window panes. Heavy velvet drapes framed the tall glass, allowing only pale moonlight to cut through the shadows. Dust motes danced lazily in the cold illumination, suspending the room in a quiet holding pattern. He was standing by the far window, his back completely turned to the room. Julian was not working. The massive antique desk behind him was cluttered with legal portfolios and blueprint sets, but he was entirely disconnected from his empire. He stood with his hands deep in the pockets of his dark trousers, his broad shoulders rigid beneath the charcoal wool of his sweater. He projected an aura of untouchable, winter stone authority. Yet, armed with his grandmother's quiet revelation, I no longer saw a ruthless tycoon. I saw a man locked inside his own silence. He heard the soft click of the heavy door closing behind me, but he did not immediately turn. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted, the air growing thick with the simple reality of our physical proximity. "I asked the staff not to disturb me, Arthur," he murmured, assuming the intrusion was his lawyer. The tone was clipped, efficient, and devoid of warmth. "It isn't Arthur," I said quietly. Julian froze. His absolute stillness was a sudden violent paralysis. I watched the muscles in his broad back lock into place as he slowly turned to face me. The winter light caught the sharp angles of his jaw, highlighting the exhausted shadows beneath his eyes. His stoic mask was firmly in place, but I could see the microscopic fracture in his composure. The way his breath hitched, just for a fraction of a second, before he forced his lungs to steady. "Clara," he said, my name sounding entirely different on his lips, now that I understood the weight behind it. His posture immediately shifted to something intensely guarded. "Is the guest suite not warm enough? I can have the staff adjust the climate control in your wing." It was a standard transactional deflection, an attempt to keep our interaction confined to the safe, sterile parameters of a host and a contracted bride. I refused to let him hide behind the architecture of his wealth. I stepped away from the door, moving deeper into his sanctuary. My boots made a soft, deliberate sound against the Persian rug, closing the massive physical distance he had intentionally placed between us. "The room is fine," I answered, keeping my voice low. I stopped on the opposite side of his heavy mahogany desk, placing my hands on the cool, polished wood. Slowly, I raised my gaze to meet his dark, guarded eyes. "I didn't come here to ask for a thicker blanket, Julian. I came here to talk about the contract." A muscle feathered along his jawline. His hands, resting at his sides, curled inward slightly. "If there is a clause you wish to renegotiate, Arthur can draft an addendum by tomorrow morning. You are entitled to a larger monthly stipend, if the current arrangement feels restrictive." "I don't want more money," I replied, the sheer absurdity making my chest ache. I held his gaze, refusing to let him retreat into the clinical safety of legal jargon. "I want to know why you are pacing the hallway outside my bedroom at 2 a.m. The silence that followed was absolute. It bit through the cedar-scented air, stripping away every illusion and meticulously crafted lie we had spun for ourselves. Julian's mask shattered. It happened in complete, heavy silence. The rigid posture of the billionaire dissolved, leaving behind a man who looked entirely unmoored. Raw panic flashed across his features as he looked away, a deep, unsteady breath rattling through his chest. He reached up, running a trembling hand through his dark hair, the gesture so profoundly human and clumsy that it made my heart ache. "She heard me," he whispered, the realization pulling a harsh, self-deprecating sound from his throat. It wasn't a question. He knew exactly who had dismantled his secret. "Maeve hears everything," I said softly, abandoning the safety of the physical barrier. I stopped just 3 feet away from him, close enough to smell the faint trace of dark coffee and cold winter air clinging to his sweater. "She explained that you didn't hire a corporate bride. She said you used a contract because it was the only language you knew." Julian closed his eyes, his tall frame swaying slightly under the weight of his own secrets. He did not deny it. He made no attempt to spin the narrative back into a corporate strategy. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the dim library was the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, measuring the final moments of our lie. When he opened his eyes, they swam with profound vulnerability. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his charcoal sweater. He did not withdraw an addendum or a checkbook. His hand trembled slightly as he retrieved a small, folded piece of paper, placing it gently on the edge of the mahogany desk. It was not a heavy legal parchment. It was a cheap, flimsy piece of thermal receipt paper. I looked down, my brow furrowing. The edges were worn soft and frayed, indicating it had been carried and folded countless times. I reached out and carefully picked it up. The texture of the paper felt rough against my thumb, and as I turned it over toward the pale light of the window, my breath caught violently in my throat. The ink was faded, but the printed logo at the top was unmistakable. It was the small, handwritten font of Helen's Oven, my bakery. I scanned the itemized list: 1 black drip coffee, 1 lavender biscuit. The total was $4.50, but the timestamp printed at the bottom made the room spin. The receipt was dated 6 months ago. It was from a freezing, Rainy Tuesday in November. Month before my father's final debts matured. Months before the bank threatened foreclosure. And long before Arthur Pendleton ever stepped foot inside my kitchen. On the bottom right corner of the worn receipt, preserved like a holy relic, was a faint, undeniable smudge of pale purple dust. My lavender flower. I kept it, Julian whispered, his voice incredibly thick with suppressed agony. He stared at the small piece of paper in my trembling hands, viewing it as a physical manifestation of his guilt. You handed it to me across the counter. You didn't look at my suit, or my watch, or the car parked outside. You just smiled, urged me to stay warm, and handed me my coffee. It was the first time in my life someone had looked at me and seen a person, rather than a bank vault. I stared at the receipt, my mind scrambling to retroactively fit this massive, undeniable truth into the timeline of my own suffering. You were there, I breathed, my voice shaking. 6 months ago, you were in my shop. I was there every Tuesday and Thursday, he confessed, the dam finally breaking. The words poured out of him in a low, rapid cadence. I used to sit in the Blacktown car, across the street in the early mornings. I watched you unlock the door. I watched you carry 50-pound sacks of grain by yourself. Because you couldn't afford a delivery service. I watched you fight, Clara. I watched you fight so hard for a legacy that was slowly dragging you underwater. He took a slow, hesitant step toward me, closing the physical gap until I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. His large, calloused hands hovered in the air between us, as if he was desperate to touch me but entirely terrified of the consequences. I wanted to help you, he continued, the raw emotion bleeding into the quiet room. But I knew who you were. You are the proudest, most fiercely independent woman I have ever known. If I had walked in and simply offered to pay off your father's debt, you would have thrown the check in my face. You would have viewed it as charity, as an attempt to buy you. My grip on the flimsy receipt tightened. He was right. If a strange billionaire had offered to pay my debts out of pity, my pride would have demanded I reject it, even if it meant losing everything my mother had built. Then the foreclosure notice hit. I saw you sitting on the back step in the rain. I heard you cry. I didn't like it. He swallowed hard, betraying his absolute lack of control. I couldn't stand it, so I used the only weapon I had. I had Arthur draft a contract. I created a scenario where you were earning the money, so your pride would allow you to take it. I didn't buy a bride, Clara. I built a legal shield to save your bakery because I was too terrified to just walk in and ask you for your name. The imposing architecture of the Sterling Empire vanished, leaving only the man before me. The ruthless real estate developer was a myth. Here in the dim, cedar-scented quiet of his sanctuary, Julian was just a man who had loved me in silence, performing the ultimate act of service without ever demanding a single ounce of gratitude in return. He had bound himself to me, placed a flawless diamond on my finger, and moved me into his ancestral home, all while fully intending to let me walk away at the end of 12 months with my legacy secured and my dignity entirely intact. You faked a corporate emergency, I whispered, the weight of his hidden devotion washing over me. You tied your own name to mine. You brought me into your family's home. You sat through a wedding ceremony, just to trick me into letting you save me. Julian finally reached out. His movements were excruciatingly slow, offering me every opportunity to pull away. He raised his hand and cupped the side of my face, his thumb lightly brushing the dampness I hadn't realized was falling from my eyes. The warmth of his rough palm against my cold skin was a quiet, grounding shock. Tell me to stop, he whispered, his dark eyes searching mine with a raw, desperate vulnerability, begging me for the boundary he refused to cross without permission. Say this was just a business deal to you, Clara. Say my silence has suffocated you. Command me to pack your bags, and I swear to you, I will walk out of this room, and you will never have to see me again. But do not ask me to pretend I don't love you. I can't play that part anymore. I looked up into the eyes of the man who had secretly guarded my life from the shadows. I felt the rough texture of the flour-dusted receipt pressed tightly by my left hand, a physical testament to a love that had patiently waited in the cold rain. I did not step back. I did not raise my walls. Instead, I leaned into the heavy, calloused warmth of his palm, closing my eyes as the last stubborn remnants of my defensive armor fell away on the Persian rug. The silence in the library was no longer a held breath. It was a deep, quiet exhale, marking the exact moment the cold transaction died, and a genuine, unwritten life began. We did not stay in the library. The heavy mahogany walls, lined with leather-bound volumes and decades of corporate ledgers, suddenly felt far too small to contain the raw truth that had just been spoken between us. Julian Sterling kept his hand wrapped warmly around mine, his grip steady, calloused and unyielding, as he led me out of his shadowed, cedar-scented sanctuary. We parted at my bedroom door that 7th night, not with the cold distance of a contract, but with the quiet, breathless anticipation of something entirely new. When morning broke on the 8th day of our arrangement, pale winter sunlight spilled through the tall windows, chasing away the shadows of the storm. Julian was waiting for me at the bottom of the grand staircase. He carried the legal parchment in his free hand. It was the 12-month marriage agreement that Arthur Pendleton had drafted, with such clinical, bloodless precision, its crisp white edges stark against the dark wool of his sweater. He reached out, lacing his fingers through mine. For the first time since I had stepped foot in this massive stone fortress, I did not feel like an intruder tiptoeing through a museum. The man walking beside me was no longer a reclusive billionaire holding the deed to my life. He was the quiet stranger who had watched me haul 50-pound sacks of flour in the freezing rain. He was the silent patron who had bought a $4 pastry just to ensure my light stayed on another day. Every assumption I had made about his coldness, his transactional nature, and his ruthless empire had been completely inverted. I looked down at our joined hands as we walked the sprawling corridors. My knuckles were rough, my skin permanently dry from constant washing, yet he held on to me as if I were the most valuable thing he had ever touched. We found Maeve Sterling in the primary kitchen. The massive, veined marble counters and heavy copper pots caught the ambient, dancing glow of the open hearth fire blazing at the far end of the room. The air was heavy, carrying the comforting, primal scent of wood smoke, roasted chestnuts, and the lingering, faint memory of the baked goods I had made days ago. The older woman was sitting in a high-backed, carved wooden chair near the stone fireplace, her delicate hands resting in her lap, a thick woven woolen blanket draped over her knees to ward off the winter chill. She did not turn her head as we crossed the threshold, but the subtle shift in her posture told me she was fully aware of our arrival. The tension in the air had shifted. We were no longer two people playing a carefully rehearsed part for the benefit of a trust fund board. We were raw, exposed, and carrying the wreckage of a massive, protective lie. Julian stopped a few feet away from the blazing hearth. He looked down at the thick stack of legal paper in his left hand. The embossed gold seal of the family trust caught the firelight, glinting like cold, unforgiving metal. It was a flawless document. It outlined my financial salvation, my behavioral expectations in public, and my inevitable, quiet departure at the end of the year. It was a masterpiece of transactional safety. It was designed not because it bound us together, but because it guaranteed we could both walk away, without ever risking a real mortal wound to our pride. "We don't need this shield anymore," I whispered, the sound of my voice cutting through the soft, hypnotic crackle of the burning logs. I did not wait for his permission. I did not ask for a lawyer to review the consequences. I reached out and took the heavy parchment from my grip. The paper felt absurdly thick in my hands, weighed down by intricate clauses, financial contingencies, and legal jargon that no longer held a single ounce of power over my reality. I expected the ruthless real estate developer to hesitate. He was a man who had lived his entire adult life governed by airtight legalities, structured risk, and absolute control. Relinquishing a contract meant stepping into the terrifying void of human unpredictability. But the man beside me did not pull back. Instead, he raised his large hand and covered mine, his rough fingers resting gently over my knuckles, silently offering his full consent to the destruction of his own armor. Together, in the quiet, wood-smoke-scented warmth of the kitchen, we gripped the top of the agreement. The sound of the thick paper tearing was startlingly loud in the still room. It was a sharp, violent rip that physically severed the corporate lie we had been hiding behind. We tore the heavy pages once in half, pulling in unison. Then we folded the halves and tore them again, reducing the flawless legal strategy into jagged, meaningless pieces of scrap. I stepped closer to the stone hearth, the intense heat of the flames immediately flushing my cheeks, and let the shredded paper fall from my opened hands. The hungry fire caught the dry parchment instantly. The crisp edges curled inward, transforming from pristine, sterile white to a brittle, fragile black ash in a matter of seconds. The meticulously typed clauses, our forged signatures, the sterile boundaries, all of it dissolved into bright orange embers. They floated briefly in the chimney draft, glowing fiercely before vanishing into the dark soot of the flue. From her wooden chair near the warmth, Maeve tilted her head. Her blind, clouded eyes did not need to witness the light of the flames to understand exactly what had just transpired. She listened to the distinct crackle of the heavy corporate paper being consumed by the fire. A slow, deeply peaceful smile spread across her weathered face. She let out a long, quiet sigh, the stiff tension in her delicate shoulders finally melting away into the wool blanket. A lawyer's precise ink is very good at protecting fortunes, the matriarch murmured, her melodic voice wrapping around us like a warm, ancestral embrace. But it is a terribly clumsy thing to wrap around a human heart. True love cannot remain hidden behind legal lines, my dear. It demands to be felt in the open. It demands to burn. Julian let out a low, shuddering breath, the sound carrying decades of accumulated isolation, finally breaking apart. He stepped behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, pulling my back flush against the solid wall of his chest. He bent his head, burying his face in the warm curve of my neck, inhaling the scent of lavender on my skin, as if it were the only oxygen left in the world. He didn't say a single word. He didn't need to. The heavy, winterstone tension that had defined his physical presence since the day he picked me up in the driving rain was gone. In its place was a quiet, yielding surrender. I rested my hands over his forearms, feeling the rough calluses on his palms, anchoring myself in the grounding reality of a protector who had finally dropped his shield. I leaned back against his chest, watching the last glowing ember turn to gray, lifeless dust. For years, my entire existence had been defined by what I owed. I owed my father's ruthless creditors. I owed the impatient bank officers. I owed the heavy, fading legacy of my mother's small bakery. But, standing in the heavy stone kitchen of the sprawling estate, surrounded by the scent of wood smoke and old cedar, the ledger of Clara Vance was finally wiped clean. It was not cleared by a billionaire paying off a debt with a stroke of a pen, but by a partner willingly choosing to step into the fire with me. We stayed there by the hearth for a long time, held softly in the peaceful silence, listening to the winter wind howl harmlessly against the thick glass of the crescent windows. The cold fortress that had been built to keep the world out had finally become a sanctuary. It did not happen all at once. The complete dismantling of a lonely, guarded life requires immense patience. We did not stay in the massive, sterile luxury of the ancestral mansion. When the deep winter finally began to thaw, breaking the bitter frost that gripped the New England coast, we packed my few practical belongings and drove back to the small, rainy coastal town where it had all started. I had secretly expected him to return to his corporate empire. I had braced myself for the reality where he would resume his rightful place in the towering glass and steel boardrooms of the city, while I reclaimed my flour-dusted counter. I assumed he would carve out small pockets of time for me on the weekends, fitting our new unwritten reality into the narrow margins of his immense corporate responsibilities. I was prepared to be a quiet refuge he visited when the heavy world of real estate development became too exhausting. But I had fundamentally misunderstood the terrifying depth of his devotion. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 months after the contract had turned to ash in his grandmother's hearth. The coastal rain was beating a familiar, steady rhythm against the fogged front glass of Helen's oven. The world outside the bakery was cold, gray, and unforgiving, but inside, the air was heavy with the comforting scent of fermenting yeast, melting butter, and the sharp, grounding fragrance of dried lavender. I stood at the chipped wooden counter, my bare hands buried deep in a pale, yielding mound of sourdough. The terrifying financial notices no longer haunted the small space beside the cash register. The heavy, suffocating weight of generational debt was lifted, leaving behind only the pure, simple labor of my mother's beloved craft. A subtle shift in the draft near the back hallway told me I was no longer alone in the kitchen. I did not turn around immediately, allowing the quiet, deeply reassuring familiarity of his physical presence to wash over my tense shoulders. Julian stepped up to the wooden counter beside me. He was not wearing a tailored clinical charcoal suit, nor the heavy, imposing wool overcoats that made him look like an untouchable winter king. He wore a simple, faded cotton Henley, the dark sleeves pushed up past his elbows to reveal the corded muscles and faint scars of his forearms. His dark hair was slightly rumpled, damp from walking through the morning coastal fog. I glanced down at his left wrist as he reached forward. The heavy, ostentatious platinum watch he used to wear, the precise timepiece that signaled his immense wealth to rival developers, was completely missing. In its place was nothing but the bare, warm skin of a man who no longer needed to measure his worth in corporate time or liquid assets. He did not speak to announce his arrival. He simply reached into the massive ceramic bowl resting between us, pulling out a fistful of raw, white flour, and dusted his side of the worn wooden counter with practiced ease. He dragged a heavy portion of the resting dough toward himself, pressing his broad palms into the yielding mass. We worked together in a quiet, rhythmic harmony. There was no need for verbal instructions, no need for the frantic, defensive energy I used to pour into my baking when I was fighting the world alone. When I folded the soft dough over on itself, he mirrored the precise movement. When I leaned my weight into the counter to knead, he moved in tandem, his large, capable hands working the flour with a slow, deliberate reverence. The stoic man who owned city skylines and sprawling ancestral estates was standing in a cramped, humid coastal bakery, willingly surrendering every ounce of his worldly power to simply share in my daily labor. "You're pressing a little too hard on the left side," I murmured softly, bumping my flour-dusted shoulder gently against his solid arm. He paused his rhythmic kneading, turning his head to look down at me. A slow, warm smile broke across his guarded face, a rare, quiet expression that still possessed the power to make my breath catch. "I'm used to building foundations with steel and concrete. You have to give me a little more time to adjust to the temperamental nature of flour." I smiled back, reaching over with my right hand to lightly brush a stray smudge of white powder from his sharp jawline. "Write the life you want. I'll meet you there." The words slipped out of my mouth quietly, a soft, spontaneous realization of the incredible vow we were actively building together in this small, flour-dusted room. Julian leaned down, closing his eyes as he pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my flour-streaked forehead. "I'm already here," he whispered warmly against my skin, his low voice carrying the deep, resonant peace of a man who had finally stopped running from his own heart. He stepped back just enough to resume his gentle kneading, the quiet, methodical rhythm of our shared task, filling the small space where fear used to live. As the pale morning light slowly pushed through the coastal fog, illuminating the warm, dusty air of the kitchen, I stood back and simply watched him. I watched the once ruthless tycoon carefully shape a simple loaf of bread, treating the raw, unrefined ingredients with the exact same fierce protectiveness he used to silently guard my heart. We did not need a grand, highly publicized society wedding to validate our bond to the world. We did not need the formal approval of a conservative trust board or a flawless legal document to prove the depth of our commitment. True devotion was never going to be found in flawless diamonds, massive bank transfers, or calculated corporate maneuvers. It was found right here, in the quiet, consistent sanctuary of silent protection. It was the daily, unglamorous choice to stand beside someone in the early, freezing hours of the morning, matching their movements, carrying their heavy burdens, and letting the peaceful silence speak entirely for itself. Later that afternoon, when the last golden loaf had been pulled from the hot stone oven, and the shop was officially closed to the relentless coastal rain, the bakery fell into a deep, comforting stillness. Julian walked over to the small electric kettle sitting on the back counter. He filled it with fresh water, waiting patiently for the soft, familiar whistle to cut through the quiet, before deliberately pouring the boiling water over a delicate, fragrant blend of chamomile and mint leaves. He carried the 2 steaming ceramic mugs over to the small, scratched wooden table, tucked in the back corner, setting one gently in front of me before taking the creaking wooden seat directly opposite. I wrapped my tired, aching hands around the warm ceramic, inhaling the soothing, herbal steam as it curled into the cool air. I looked across the small table at my husband. He was watching me with that exact same quiet, steady intensity he had shown in the library, his dark eyes anchored firmly on my face. He wasn't asking for a performance. He wasn't demanding a return on his investment. He was asking for nothing but my continued presence in his life. Home isn't a place or a name. It's a person. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again. Tell me in the comments, have you ever found your sanctuary in the silence? Take care of yourselves, and I will meet you here next time.